Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself.
I knew something irreversible had begun the moment I realized the secret wasn't frightening me as much as the silence I had kept around it. The house was quiet in the particular way it only ever was in the late afternoon, when the day had not yet decided whether it would end gently or unravel into something sharp. I had come home earlier than usual, carrying with me the dull ache of a conversation at work that had left me feeling strangely hollow, as if I had nodded my way through my own life without ever speaking in it. I remember putting my keys down too carefully, as though the sound of metal on wood might wake something that had been asleep for years, and I remember noticing how the light coming through the window caught dust in the air and made it look intentional, like the room was holding its breath. I wasn't looking for anything when I opened the drawer in our bedroom. That's important to say, because for a long time afterward I tried to rewrite that moment as curiosity, or suspicion, or even fate. In truth, it was habit. I was searching for a charger, the same one I always misplaced, and my hand brushed against something that didn't belong to the geography of socks and folded shirts I knew by muscle memory. A small container, tucked far back, light in my hand but heavy with implication. I didn't open it right away. I sat on the edge of the bed and held it there, feeling foolish for the way my heart sped up. I told myself that marriages are built on trust, that private doesn't mean hidden, that I was allowed to put it back and forget I had ever touched it. All of those thoughts arrived fully formed and righteous, which should have been my first clue that they were rehearsed defenses rather than truths. Inside were medications I recognized from years of reading labels and listening to commercials I had never paid attention to before.
Hormones.
Prescribed. Carefully organized. Not old, not forgotten, not something that could be explained away as a temporary imbalance or a friend's errand run. I remember the precise feeling of my stomach dropping, not from betrayal, but from the sudden awareness that there was a story unfolding in my own home that I had not been invited into. I closed the container and put it back exactly where it had been. That act felt like a promise and a lie at the same time. For the rest of that evening, I moved through our shared space like a guest who didn't know the rules. I watched my wife cook dinner, listened to her talk about her day, nodded at the right moments. She laughed at something trivial, and I felt a rush of affection, so sharp it almost hurt. I wanted to ask her everything and nothing. I wanted to confess that I had seen the container, and I wanted to pretend it had never existed. Mostly, I wanted to understand why the discovery had stirred something in me that felt less like fear and more like recognition. That night, after she had fallen asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, tracing old cracks I had memorized years ago. My thoughts refused to line up neatly. I told myself that this was her journey, her body, her autonomy. I told myself that being a supportive partner meant patience and respect. All of that was true. What I did not tell myself, because I didn't yet have the language for it, was that her secret had brushed against something unexamined in me, something that had been quietly waiting for permission to exist. I grew up learning very clearly what I was supposed to be, not in cruel ways, not through overt punishment, but through repetition. Boys did this. Men wore that. Certain curiosities were framed as jokes, others as warnings. I learned early how to edit myself, how to laugh along when something felt uncomfortably close to home, how to redirect attention outward so no one ever thought to look inward. It worked so well that eventually I believed the performance myself. Marriage had not erased that editing, it had simply given it a stage that felt respectable. I was a husband, dependable, predictable. I took pride in that. And yet, lying there in the dark, I couldn't shake the sense that I had spent my life standing just outside a door I didn't know I was allowed to open. Over the following weeks, the container in the drawer became a quiet gravity in the room. I never touched it again, but I felt its presence whenever I folded laundry or reached for socks. I began to notice other things too, details I might have once dismissed. My wife's careful phrasing when talking about doctor's appointments. The way she paused before answering certain questions, not evasively, but thoughtfully, as if she were practicing telling a truth that required new muscles. I didn't confront her. I told myself I was giving her space. In reality, I was afraid of what opening that conversation might ask of me. It was during one of those afternoons alone, the house empty and still, that I did something I would have once sworn I was incapable of. I was putting away clean clothes, moving through the familiar ritual, when my hand hovered over a garment that was unmistakably hers. I had handled her clothes 1,000 times before without incident, but this time there was a hesitation that felt almost ceremonial. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the sound of my own breathing. I wish I could say the decision was made with courage or clarity. It wasn't. It was made with a quiet curiosity that felt more honest than any explanation I could give. I closed the bedroom door, not because I thought someone would come in, but because the act itself felt like crossing a threshold, and thresholds deserve acknowledgement. Putting on her clothing was not the dramatic moment people imagine. There was no sudden revelation, no rush of excitement. What there was, instead, was an unexpected sense of calm, followed closely by grief. Grief for the years I had spent policing my own impulses. Grief for the ease with which I had accepted limits that were never questioned. Standing there, looking at myself, I did not feel transformed. I felt exposed, in the most literal and metaphorical sense of the word. The mirror did not show me someone else. It showed me someone paying attention. I took the clothing off almost immediately. The act was not about staying in that moment. It was about acknowledging it. I folded everything carefully and put it back exactly where it belonged. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were not. I sat on the bed afterward and tried to understand what I had just learned about myself. What frightened me was not the act itself, but the realization that it had felt honest. Not complete, not defining, but honest in a way that bypassed the roles I had been playing. I thought about my wife and the courage it must take to carry a secret like hers, to navigate a world that insists on simple categories when lived experience is anything but simple. For the first time, her silence made a different kind of sense to me. That evening, when she came home, I watched her with new eyes. Not suspicious, not distant, but attentive. I wondered how long she had been listening to herself before taking action. I wondered what it would mean to offer her the kind of understanding I was only beginning to offer myself. I did not speak. I was not ready. But something had shifted, and I knew that going back to ignorance was no longer possible. In the days that followed, I began to read. Quietly, deliberately. Not sensational stories, not headlines designed to provoke, but personal accounts, research, reflections. I learned words I had never needed before. I learned how much harm is done by treating identity as a spectacle rather than a conversation. I learned that exploration does not always demand declaration, and that empathy begins long before agreement. Most of all, I learned that honesty is not a single confession but a practice. One that requires patience, humility, and a willingness to sit with discomfort without rushing to resolve it. I did not tell my wife what I had done. Not yet. The secret I carried was different from hers, but it weighed on me in similar ways. I understood, suddenly, that revealing it would not be about unburdening myself, but about inviting her into a space of vulnerability that had to be built carefully, respectfully. Love, I was beginning to see, is not proven by how loudly we speak, but by how thoughtfully we choose our moments. Looking back now, I can see that this was the beginning, not of a transformation I could point to on the surface, but of a reorientation inward. A slow, sometimes uncomfortable alignment between who I had been taught to be and who I was willing to listen to. It started with a drawer opened by accident, a choice made in solitude, and a realization that identity is less about labels and more about attention. I didn't yet know where this path would lead, or how many conversations it would require, or what it would ask me to risk. I only knew that something important had been set in motion, and that pretending otherwise would be the greatest dishonesty of all. The next thing that changed wasn't dramatic at all, and for a while I almost missed it, which feels fitting given how much of my life I had spent missing myself. It began with listening. Not the polite, nodding kind of listening I had perfected over the years, but the kind that lingers after a conversation ends, the kind that keeps working on you while you're brushing your teeth or staring out a window. I found myself replaying small moments with my wife, fragments I had previously filed away as ordinary. A pause before she answered a question about her health. The careful neutrality she used when friends talked about bodies, aging, expectations. None of it screamed revelation, but taken together, it formed a quiet pattern I could no longer unsee. What unsettled me most was how much I recognized myself in that restraint. At work, I had always been considered even-tempered, reliable, the person who didn't bring personal complications into professional spaces. People said it like a compliment. I had accepted it like a badge. Now, I began to wonder what it had cost me to earn that reputation. How many times had I chosen invisibility over honesty because it felt safer, cleaner, easier to explain? I didn't suddenly start wearing my wife's clothes again. That moment remained singular, almost sacred in its brevity. But it unlocked something quieter and more persistent, permission to notice my internal responses without immediately judging or suppressing them. When I passed a mirror, I didn't interrogate my reflection the way I used to, searching for flaws or reassurance. Instead, I asked myself a new question, one that felt radical in its simplicity. How do I feel right now? The answers were rarely neat. Sometimes the answer was confusion. Sometimes it was tenderness, especially when I thought about my wife navigating something complex and deeply personal without my knowledge. Sometimes it was fear of what this meant for me, for us, for the structure of a life I had built carefully and responsibly. And sometimes, unexpectedly, it was relief. Relief that there was more to me than the narrow script I had been handed. Relief that curiosity did not automatically lead to chaos. One evening, we were washing dishes together, a mundane choreography we had performed countless times. She handed me a plate, our fingers brushing briefly, and for reasons I still struggle to articulate, that small contact carried weight. I looked at her hands, hands I knew intimately, hands that had comforted me, steadied me, and I wondered what it would mean to truly know someone while also allowing them to remain partially unknown. "You've been quiet lately," she said, not accusingly, just observant. I almost laughed at how carefully the universe seemed to set these moments up. This was the opening, clean and unforced. I could step through it. I could tell her about the drawer, about the reading, about the way my internal landscape had shifted. Instead, I took a breath and chose honesty's slower cousin. "I've been thinking," I said. It felt insufficient, but it was true. She nodded, accepting that answer with a grace that made my chest ache. In that moment, I understood something crucial. Disclosure is not a single event, and intimacy is not built by unloading everything at once. It's built by showing up consistently, by aligning words with actions over time. Later that night, I returned to my reading, but my focus had changed. I wasn't looking for instructions or labels anymore. I was looking for context. I wanted to understand how people make sense of themselves without turning that process into a performance. I learned about gender expression as a spectrum of experience rather than a checklist of behaviors. I learned that questioning does not obligate you to conclude anything, and that uncertainty can be a stable place to stand. This reframing mattered more than I expected. It allowed me to see my experience not as a deviation, but as a dialogue between past and present, expectation and reality. It also sharpened my sense of responsibility. Exploring my identity was not something I could do in isolation, pretending it had no impact on the people I loved. Any path forward would have to be grounded in respect, consent, and care. The next time I was alone in the house, I stood in the bedroom doorway for a long time before moving. I wasn't drawn by impulse this time, but by intention. I opened the drawer again, not to touch anything, but to acknowledge its existence without flinching. It struck me how symbolic that felt. I could see the truth and still choose how to engage with it. What surprised me was how much this process softened me. I found myself more patient at work, less reactive in conversations. It was as though attending to my own internal complexity had made it easier to recognize complexity in others. When a colleague snapped during a meeting, I didn't dismiss them as difficult. I wondered what they were carrying. When a family member made an offhand comment about people these days, I didn't rush to argue. I listened for the fear beneath the judgment. None of this made me enlightened or resolved. If anything, it made me more aware of how much I didn't know. But it also grounded me in a sense of integrity I hadn't realized I was missing. I was no longer performing certainty for the sake of comfort. I was practicing honesty, quietly and perfectly. The tension, however, did not disappear. It concentrated. Every day I didn't speak to my wife about what I was learning felt both protective and deceptive. I reminded myself that timing matters, that blurting out half-formed truths can do more harm than good. Still, the weight of withholding pressed against me. I began to imagine the conversation, not as a confession, but as an invitation. An invitation to share vulnerability, to acknowledge that we were both, in our own ways, navigating identities shaped by forces larger than us. I didn't yet know how to begin that conversation, or what words would do it justice. I only knew that it would need to come from a place of humility, not entitlement. My exploration did not grant me moral authority or special insight. It granted me responsibility. As I lay in bed one night, listening to her breathing, steady and familiar, I realized that the most important transformation underway was not about presentation or labels. It was about learning how to be present without armor. How to let truth emerge at a human pace. How to love someone not by fitting them into your understanding, but by expanding your understanding to meet them. I turned onto my side, facing her, and felt a quiet resolve settle in me. The path ahead was still unclear, but it no longer felt abstract. It felt relational. And that, more than anything, made it worth walking carefully. The conversation, when it finally began, did not start with the words I had practiced in my head. It started with a question that surprised us both. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the television on but muted, the room filled with that low, ambient hum that usually made silence feel companionable. This time it felt intentional, like we were both waiting for something to surface. I watched her absent-mindedly twist the edge of a cushion between her fingers, a small habit I knew meant she was thinking carefully. "Do you ever feel," she said slowly, "like you've been living correctly but not truthfully?" The air shifted. Not dramatically, not violently, just enough that I felt it register in my chest before my mind caught up. I didn't answer right away. I was suddenly acutely aware of how easy it would be to deflect, to make a joke, to turn the question philosophical and safe. Instead, I let it land where it wanted to. "Yes," I said. The word came out steadier than I felt, more often than I used to. She nodded, not surprised, but relieved. That nod told me this wasn't a confession she was offering as much as a bridge she was building. What followed wasn't a reveal so much as an unfolding. She talked about feeling out of alignment with herself for years, about the exhaustion of translating her internal experience into something palatable for the outside world. She spoke carefully, not because she was unsure, but because she respected the weight of what she was saying. I listened without interrupting, aware that this was not the moment to match her vulnerability with my own. This was about witnessing. When she told me about the hormones, there was no drama in her voice. No apology, no justification. Just a quiet statement of fact, followed by a pause that invited response, but didn't demand it. I felt a rush of emotions, concern, admiration, fear, gratitude, but none of them translated into panic. Instead, I felt grounded by the honesty of it. "I found them," I said eventually, choosing my words with care. "By accident." Her eyes flicked to mine, searching. I continued before she could retreat inward. "I didn't mean to, and I didn't touch anything. But I want you to know that I've been trying to understand. Not just what you're doing, but what it feels like." There it was, the line I couldn't uncross. She exhaled, a sound that held months of tension. "Thank you for telling me," she said, "and for not making it about catching me." That night, we talked longer than we had in years. Not in a rushed, emotional torrent, but in careful exchanges that felt like placing stones across a river, testing each one before stepping forward. I told her about my reading, about how learning had softened my assumptions. I did not tell her yet about the clothing. Not because I was hiding it, but because I was still learning how to frame it truthfully, not as a headline but as context. What struck me most was how little either of us tried to persuade the other of anything. There were no ultimatums, no demands for immediate clarity. Just a shared acknowledgement that we were both evolving in ways that didn't fit the version of marriage we had inherited by default. In the weeks that followed, our home changed subtly. Not in decor or routine, but in emotional temperature. We checked in with each other more deliberately. We asked questions that didn't assume answers. There were moments of discomfort, of course. Awkward silences, missteps, fears voiced too sharply or too softly. But there was also an emerging sense of partnership that felt more conscious than before. It was during this period that I finally told her about the moment in the bedroom. I expected shock. I expected confusion. What I got instead was stillness. I explained it carefully, emphasizing what it was and what it wasn't. Not a declaration. Not a demand. Just an experience that had revealed something about how tightly I had been holding myself. I told her how brief it was, how it hadn't felt illicit or thrilling, just honest in a way I hadn't anticipated. She listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "That makes sense," she said after a long pause. "Not because it's common or uncommon, but because when you start questioning one inherited rule, others get louder." That sentence stayed with me. It reframed my experience not as an anomaly, but as a natural response to proximity with truth. I hadn't been pulled into something foreign. I had been allowed closer to myself. We talked about boundaries then, explicitly and respectfully. About privacy. About pace. About how exploration for either of us would need to be grounded in consent and communication. That conversation mattered more than any conclusion we might have drawn. It reminded me that self-discovery does not absolve us of responsibility to others. If anything, it heightens it. As time passed, I noticed that my sense of self was becoming less rigid. I stopped thinking in terms of permission and transgression and started thinking in terms of alignment. Some days, that meant nothing more than allowing myself emotional range without self-correction. Other days, it meant sitting with questions that had no immediate answers. I didn't rush toward labels. I didn't feel the need to announce anything to the world. What I felt was a growing respect for the complexity of identity and for the courage it takes to live with integrity inside that complexity. Publicly, little changed. Privately, almost everything had. I was learning that transformation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, patiently, until you learn how to listen. And once you do, it's very hard to pretend you haven't heard it. What surprised me next was how ordinary life insisted on continuing, even as my internal map was being quietly redrawn. There were groceries to buy, emails to answer, family obligations that arrived on schedule and expected the same version of me they had always known. I showed up to these moments mostly unchanged on the surface, and yet I felt different inside them, like I was standing a few inches to the left of where I used to stand. That small shift altered everything. Conversations sounded different. Assumptions revealed their seams. I became acutely aware of how often people speak in shorthand about identity, as if complexity were an inconvenience rather than a fact of being human. My wife noticed the change before anyone else. She said I seemed more present, less brittle. I hadn't realized how guarded I'd been until I started lowering those defenses. There was a tenderness in our interactions that felt earned rather than nostalgic, as if we were choosing each other again with fuller information. With that tenderness came fear. Not the dramatic kind, but the slow, practical fear of consequences. What would this mean long-term? How would our families react if her journey became visible? How would mine respond if my own questions ever moved from private reflection to shared reality? These weren't hypotheticals we could solve with philosophy. They were social, relational, material concerns. Ignoring them would have been irresponsible. We talked about timing a lot, about how disclosure is not owed to everyone equally, and how safety, emotional and otherwise, matters. These conversations taught me something I hadn't learned before, that integrity is not synonymous with immediacy. You can be honest without being exposed. You can be truthful without being reckless. That distinction felt like a gift. My own exploration remained quiet. I didn't repeat the moment in the bedroom often, but I didn't treat it like a forbidden memory either. Instead, I paid attention to what it had revealed. I noticed how my posture changed when I allowed myself softness. How my emotional vocabulary expanded when I stopped filtering it through what I thought a man should sound like. None of this required an audience. In fact, it thrived in privacy. One afternoon, I accompanied my wife to an appointment she had invited me to attend. Sitting in that waiting room, surrounded by pamphlets and neutral-tone furniture, I felt a profound sense of humility. This was not about me, and yet being there changed me. Listening to professionals speak with care and precision about bodies and identities reminded me how much harm is caused by ignorance masquerading as certainty. Education, I realized, isn't about memorizing terms. It's about learning how to listen without defensiveness. Afterward, we walked in silence for a while. Then she said, "Thank you for coming without trying to fix anything." I understood then that support is not an action plan. It's a posture. As weeks turned into months, the initial intensity of discovery settled into something steadier. Not resolution, but integration. I no longer felt like I was standing at the edge of a secret cliff. I felt like I was inhabiting my life more fully, even when that meant holding contradictions. Especially then. There were still moments of doubt. Late nights when I wondered if curiosity itself was a betrayal of the life I had committed to. Mornings when I felt the pull of old habits urging me back into certainty. But those moments no longer frightened me. They felt like part of the work, evidence that growth rarely travels in a straight line. What anchored me was accountability. To my wife. To myself. To the understanding that whatever shape my identity took, it would have to be lived ethically, with care for the people affected by it. This wasn't about self-indulgence. It was about self-respect and the respect that flows outward from it. I didn't know where all of this would lead. I still don't. But I had learned something essential, that asking honest questions, even quietly, can change the moral texture of your life. It can make you kinder, more patient, more awake. And once you've experienced that kind of awakening, the real challenge isn't transformation. It's stewardship. How you carry what you've learned into the world without turning it into something careless or cruel. There was a season after that where nothing outwardly significant happened, and yet I think it may have been the most consequential period of all. It's tempting to believe that change announces itself through milestones, decisions made, lines crossed, declarations spoken. But what actually reshaped me was repetition. The daily practice of noticing myself without immediately correcting myself. The discipline of pausing before reacting. The slow recalibration of what I considered normal. I began to see how much of my earlier life had been governed by avoidance masquerading as responsibility. I had been proud of how little trouble I caused, how rarely I complicated things. Now I could see that this hadn't always been maturity. Sometimes it was simply fear dressed up as virtue. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of discovering that the self I had constructed so carefully might not be as complete as I had assumed. At first, this realization brought shame. I replayed old moments with new awareness. Times I had laughed along with jokes that flattened complexity into ridicule. Times I had stayed silent when someone else was being reduced to a stereotype because speaking up felt inconvenient. I hadn't been cruel, but I hadn't been brave either. Sitting with that truth was uncomfortable, but it was also clarifying. Growth, I was learning, often begins with grief for the person you thought you were. My wife noticed this phase before I named it. One evening, she said gently, "You're being very hard on your past self." I told her I felt complicit in things I hadn't questioned, that I worried my awakening was too late to matter. She shook her head. "Awareness doesn't work on a schedule," she said. "It works when it works." That sentence lodged itself deep in me. It reframed responsibility not as retroactive punishment, but as forward-facing care. I couldn't undo what I hadn't known, but I could choose differently now. That, I realized, was where accountability lived, not in self-flagellation, but in changed behavior. As her own journey became incrementally more visible, subtle changes in how she spoke about herself, how she carried herself, I became acutely aware of how public perception operates. People don't notice gradual evolution. They notice deviation from expectation. A slight change that goes unremarked one day can suddenly become obvious once someone decides to look for it. Watching this happen to her sharpened my empathy in ways theory never could. I saw how even well-meaning people asked questions that treated her experience like a curiosity rather than a life. How concern sometimes disguised control. How silence could be protective in one context and erasing in another. I learned that being supportive did not mean positioning myself as enlightened or progressive. It meant being consistent, reliable, and willing to absorb discomfort without redirecting it back onto her. In that sense, my own quieter exploration felt less like a parallel journey and more like a deepening capacity. I wasn't chasing an outcome. I was learning how to be with complexity without demanding it resolve on my timetable. There were moments, though, when my own reflection caught me off guard. Not visually, but emotionally. I would be struck by a sense of softness, an ease with myself that I had never cultivated before. It wasn't tied to presentation or behavior. It was an internal permission slip. You don't have to harden yourself to be legitimate. That idea alone would have been unthinkable to me years earlier. I started to notice how much emotional labor masculinity had cost me. How often I had translated tenderness into stoicism, curiosity into silence, vulnerability into jokes. Letting go of those translations didn't make me less grounded. It made me more precise. My feelings were no longer blunt instruments. They became sources of information. This shift affected my relationships beyond my marriage. Friends commented that I seemed easier to talk to. One confided something deeply personal to me and later said, "I don't know why I told you that. It just felt safe." I understood then that safety is not something you declare. It's something you embody. Family gatherings were harder. Not because anyone knew anything concrete, but because I could feel the tension between who I was becoming and who I was expected to remain. Old dynamics surfaced. Jokes that relied on rigid gender roles, assumptions about the future spoken as facts. I didn't challenge everything. That would have been performative and exhausting. Instead, I chose moments. A question here. A reframing there. Small interruptions to inevitability. What struck me was how often resistance softened when it wasn't met with accusation. When curiosity replaced condemnation. That didn't mean everyone changed their minds. But it did mean conversations became possible where they hadn't been before. I began to see social change not as a battle of arguments, but as a gradual widening of what people can imagine. At home, my wife and I continued to negotiate boundaries with care. We revisited them periodically, acknowledging that needs evolve. This was new territory for both of us. We had grown up with models of relationships that treated change as a threat rather than a constant. Learning to revise our agreements felt strangely intimate. It required trust not just in each other, but in our shared capacity to adapt. There were nights when fear resurfaced sharply. Fear of social consequences. Fear of loss. Fear that one of us might grow in a direction the other couldn't follow. We didn't pretend those fears weren't real. We named them, not to dramatize them, but to keep them from quietly dictating our choices. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's refusing to let fear make decisions for you. Through all of this, I became increasingly aware of how little language we are given for middle spaces. You're expected to know exactly who you are, exactly what you want, exactly where you're going. But lived experience is rarely that tidy. Most of us are negotiating ourselves into existence, adjusting as we learn. There is dignity in that process, even when it doesn't produce a clear label or a satisfying conclusion. I stopped thinking of my experience as something that needed justification. It didn't need to prove anything. It had already done its work by making me more attentive, more honest, more humane. That I began to believe was enough. If transformation has a moral dimension, it lies there, not in how visibly different you become, but in how responsibly you carry what you've learned. In how you treat others once you understand how fragile certainty can be. In how you refuse to turn someone else's complexity into a shorthand for your comfort. Looking back, I can see that this longer, quieter part of the journey was where the foundation was laid. Not for an identity, but for a way of being. One that could hold ambiguity without panic. One that could prioritize empathy over performance. One that understood that becoming yourself is less about arrival than about stewardship, of truth, of relationships, of the shared world we are all trying to navigate with imperfect maps. By the time this season began to shift, I wasn't searching for permission anymore. I was practicing care, and that made all the difference. The moment I understood that nothing about this journey was asking me to hurry was the moment it began to feel sustainable. That realization didn't arrive as insight so much as fatigue. Not exhaustion, exactly, but a quiet refusal inside me to keep narrating my life as if it were headed toward a verdict. I stopped waking up with the question, what does this mean about me? And started waking up with a different one. How do I live today with integrity? That change mattered more than anything else that followed. By then, my wife and I had settled into a rhythm that felt honest without being rigid. Her path continued with intention and care, shaped by medical guidance, personal reflection, and an ongoing assessment of what visibility meant in different contexts. I watched her grow more comfortable not just in her body, but in her authority over her own narrative. She no longer explained herself preemptively. She answered questions when she chose to, declined them when she didn't, and seemed less burdened by the need to manage other people's reactions. Witnessing that taught me something profound about agency. I had spent much of my life assuming that clarity was something you owed others so they would know how to treat you. Now I saw that clarity, when forced too early or too publicly, can become another form of compliance. Real self-respect includes the right to unfold at your own pace. My own internal life continued to evolve quietly. I no longer thought of that early moment in the bedroom as an outlier or a catalyst. It became, instead, a reference point, a reminder of what it feels like to encounter yourself without armor. I didn't feel compelled to repeat it in any literal way. The value of the experience had already been integrated. It had taught me how to listen inwardly without panic, how to let curiosity exist without turning it into spectacle or shame. There was a noticeable change in how I carried myself in the world. Not confidence in the performative sense, but coherence. I was less reactive, less invested in defending an image. When people made assumptions about me, I noticed them without immediately trying to correct or confirm them. I understood, finally, that being misread is not the same as being erased. Sometimes it's simply the cost of not narrating yourself for every room you enter. That distinction gave me peace. There were still moments of reckoning. A family member once asked a question about my wife that was framed as concern but carried an edge of judgment. I felt the old instinct rise, to smooth things over, to minimize, to keep everyone comfortable. Instead, I paused. I responded calmly, clearly, without apology or aggression. I didn't disclose more than was necessary. I didn't defend her existence. I simply set a boundary around respect. Afterward, I realized my hands were shaking. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because I had done something new. Growth, I was learning, is often physiologically uncomfortable even when it is morally aligned. Another time, a friend confided that they were struggling with their own sense of identity, unsure where their feelings fit into any recognizable category. As they spoke, I recognized an earlier version of myself, the isolation, the fear of asking the wrong question and losing stability in the process. I didn't offer advice. I didn't share my story unless it felt relevant. I listened. When they finished, they said, "I don't feel fixed, but I feel less alone." That felt like confirmation that this journey had given me something worth carrying forward. What I came to understand, slowly and with some humility, is that transformation is not inherently virtuous. It doesn't make you wiser by default, or kinder or more ethical. Those outcomes depend on what you do with the awareness you gain. Self-discovery can easily become self-absorption if it's not tethered to responsibility. I was determined not to let that happen. Responsibility, for me, came to mean a few specific things. Telling the truth when it mattered, even if my voice shook. Protecting privacy, mine and others, in a culture that rewards exposure. Remaining teachable, especially when confronted with perspectives that challenged my comfort. And perhaps most importantly, refusing to turn complexity into a badge of superiority. I didn't want to be someone who had figured it out. I wanted to be someone who stayed honest. Over time, the fear that this journey would dismantle my life faded. Not because nothing changed, but because what changed strengthened rather than fractured my relationships. My marriage was no longer held together by unspoken agreements about who we were supposed to be. It was held together by active choice, by the ongoing work of seeing each other clearly and responding with care. I understood then that identity, when approached with integrity, does not pull people apart. Avoidance does. Silence does. Shame does. Honesty, even when it complicates things, creates the possibility of alignment. If there is one thing I wish I had known earlier, it is this. You do not have to fully understand yourself to treat yourself with dignity. You do not have to reach a final definition to live ethically. The work is not to arrive, but to attend to your inner life, to the impact you have on others, to the spaces where fear and compassion intersect. I didn't emerge from this experience with a new label or a dramatic external transformation. What I emerged with was quieter and more durable, a deeper empathy for lives lived under constraint, a respect for the courage it takes to question inherited rules, and a commitment to carry uncertainty without turning it into harm. Looking back, I can say that the discovery that once frightened me most did not unravel my sense of self. It refined it. It taught me that authenticity is not about revelation for its own sake, but about alignment between values and behavior. About choosing honesty over convenience, care over certainty, presence over performance. And if this story has any meaning beyond my own life, I hope it is this, that becoming more yourself does not require becoming someone else. It requires listening long enough to hear what has been asking for your attention all along, and then responding thoughtfully, responsibly, and with compassion for everyone involved. By the time I understood that this was not a story about discovery, but about orientation, about how I faced the world rather than what I named myself, the urgency that once shadowed everything finally loosened its grip. Nothing resolved in a cinematic way. There was no final conversation that wrapped our lives into something easily summarized. Instead, there was continuity, days stacked on days. Decisions made with care rather than adrenaline. A growing trust that whatever questions remained did not invalidate the life we were living, but informed it. My wife and I reached a place where honesty no longer felt like a negotiation. Not because everything was said, but because nothing essential was hidden. There's a difference between privacy and secrecy, and learning to honor that difference changed how I understood intimacy. We were no longer guarding against imagined futures. We were responding to the present with attentiveness. I noticed that I had stopped monitoring myself for signs of drift. I wasn't checking my feelings against some internal alarm system designed to alert me if I strayed too far from who I thought I was supposed to be. That vigilance had once passed for self-control. Now I could see it for what it had been, a lack of trust in my own capacity for ethical choice. Trusting myself didn't mean indulging every impulse or abandoning structure. It meant believing that I could hold complexity without acting destructively, that I could feel curiosity without betraying commitment, that I could explore internally without demanding that the world rearrange itself around my uncertainty. This trust made me calmer, but it also made me braver in small, specific ways. When conversations turned dismissive or reductive, I spoke up, not with speeches, but with questions. When people conflated visibility with legitimacy, I gently pushed back. When someone assumed they understood another person's experience because they had read a headline or heard a story once, I reminded them, without accusation, that no single narrative carries that much authority. I didn't do this to be virtuous. I did it because I had learned intimately how damaging it is to be simplified. What stayed with me most powerfully was the realization that empathy is not an emotion you feel once and keep forever. It's a discipline. It requires renewal. It asks you to notice when your comfort is being protected at someone else's expense and to choose differently, even when no one is watching. There were moments when I wondered whether my own internal journey would ever need a more external expression. I didn't dismiss the question, but I stopped treating it like a deadline. I understood now that authenticity is not measured by visibility, but by coherence, by whether your actions align with your values, by whether the people closest to you experience you as present, accountable, and real. In that sense, my life felt more honest than it ever had. The drawer in the bedroom no longer carried symbolic weight. It was just a drawer. What mattered was that I no longer needed secrets to avoid myself, nor revelations to justify my worth. I had learned how to live inside questions without being consumed by them. If there is a lesson here, it is not about gender or roles or transformation in the way those words are often marketed. It is about attention. About what happens when you stop treating your inner life as an inconvenience and start treating it as a source of information. About how much gentler you become, with yourself and others, when you accept that most people are doing the best they can with the tools they were given until they learn better ones. I am not a finished person. Neither is my wife. Neither is our marriage. That no longer frightens me. What frightens me now is the idea of certainty without reflection, of identity without accountability, of conviction without compassion. What steadies me is this: I know how to listen. I know how to pause. I know how to choose care over performance, integrity over ease, presence over fear. Those are not small things. They are the quiet architecture of a life lived ethically. And if this story has any worth beyond me, I hope it offers this reassurance to anyone standing at the edge of an unasked question. You do not need to rush. You do not need to perform. You do not need to become someone else to become more yourself. You only need the courage to pay attention and the responsibility to act on what you learn with honesty, humility, and care.